Thank you. There's two tricks to talking that I've learned. One is pay for the beer, so everyone has to like you. And two is always go right before lunch, so if I end early, I've succeeded. Hello, Warsaw. Hello, Front Trends. This is an amazing venue. You guys always do a really good job. So I'm Martin Ringlein, and most of you probably have no idea who I am, but that's fine. It's what makes Front Trends one of my most favorite conferences. It's what makes this industry so special. From the people on this stage to the audience in those seats, it really doesn't matter who we are. What matters most is sort of what we've done. It's the people we've worked with, it's the code we write, it's the inspiration that becomes. And I've done just about every job in this industry that you can do, from designer to developer to manager to CEO. I've worked for just about every kind of company that you can work for, from a crappy cubicle in Beltsville, Maryland, to Apple at One Infinite Loop. I've been hired, I've been fired, I've been acquired. I sold my last company to Twitter. I just raised $1 million on my next, and somewhere in between it all, I was an innovation fellow at the White House. But I'm certainly not going to spend the next 30 minutes just talking about myself, even though that'd be really fun for me. I have been extremely fortunate to have a very interesting career over the past decade and a half. Some might even say that I've been pretty lucky. Fortunate, yes. Lucky, absolutely. I've just happened to always find myself in the right place at the right time, sort of on the right side of innovation, at a time when what we were doing was probably much more crazy than it was practical. My father used to always say to me, better lucky than good. And I used to love thinking about what that meant. And now I'm at a place where I don't even know if I really believe in it anymore. We work in an industry where we literally have the skills to make our own luck. Every single day, we have the ability to be better than good. And every single day, we have the power to redefine what it means to be great in this industry. What I want to talk about is experimenting, and not the kind you do in college. It's a whole nother talk that we'll have over those beers. What I want to talk about are front-end experiments. We've all seen them, marveled at them, jaw-dropped, drooled, and I'm willing to bet that most of us have done them. Most of us probably don't even call them experiments. We call them fun, we call them hobbies, call them pastimes. Front-end experiments fundamentally shift and shape our profession. But since the first line of code that deviated from the spec, we've had pushback. It's a constant struggle between conforming to a standard and innovating an industry. And over the past 2 decades, we've heard everything from what if JavaScript is disabled, to how will it render in Outlook, to everyone's favorite, what about IE6? And now that's IE7, IE8, IE9. It's frustrating to be the ones in the room that have the skill to put progress forward, but lack the power to overcome the pushback from above. And so what I want to do is I want to talk about a few designers and developers. Like I said, I won't talk about myself, but just ordinary people who have gone on to do extraordinary things, and it all started with just one simple front-end experiment. First person I want to talk about is Alex Korone. It's another person where probably most of you have never heard of him, but he's probably inspired you or inspired the people that came before you that inspired you. And I met Alex a long time ago, one of the first designers and developers that I've ever met, when I first started a job where I was a creative director, and I had to hire people for the very first time, and I had to build a team. And that was kind of terrifying, because I didn't even know how to interview anybody. I didn't know what to look for. I already thought that maybe I wasn't good enough, so how was I going to find people who were good enough or that were better than me? And Alex, he applied to a job that we had put out. He'd sent an email, and it was pretty short and pretty brief, but it just had one URL in it. And I didn't have a lot of time, and I had to build a team pretty quickly. So I didn't really read what he wrote. I didn't really look at his resume. There was no LinkedIn at the time to look at him. I couldn't really stalk him on a Facebook or a Twitter. But I clicked that link, and it opened up. And what I saw was a collection of the most beautiful work that I had ever seen in my entire life. And all of it using CSS for layout, which at the time was a remarkable feat. Not only was nobody doing it, but nobody was making it look good. And Alex had this collection of work that just, it floored me. I showed it to everybody I knew, and I said, this is the best stuff I've ever seen. I said, I have to bring this guy in. We have to get this guy on this team as soon as possible. Now, I didn't have a lot of time to review what Alex had sent me. And Alex is the creator of something called CSS Beauty. And I don't know if you guys have ever heard of that. It was one of the first CSS galleries of its time, right along the same time as CSS Vault. And it proved to be an inspirational moment for a lot of us when we wanted to sort of start building with CSS for layout, but we didn't know if it was possible, and we didn't know who else was doing it. And this was a place that brought all that together to show us other designers and developers who were working on the same problems we were, but really pushing forward the fact that if you can dream it, somebody somewhere can build it, and it can work in every browser from IE6 to IE 5.2 on Mac. And what was funny about this is CSS Beauty was Alex's collection of the best work that inspired him. And because I didn't have a lot of time, I thought that all of the work in here was Alex's work. So obviously, it's this collection of amazing stuff. And when I brought him in, I still didn't have a lot of time. We're interviewing, he's talking, and he's charismatic, well-spoken. Just everything about him was like, oh, this guy's got to be on the team. He's going to be amazing. And we're all really young, 22, 23. And it wasn't until I think the day before he started where I just kind of was looking back at stuff, things had slowed down. I was like, all right, who's this guy? And then I realized, oh shit, I read the about, this is a gallery, right? There were no galleries at the time. So today it's how do you not know it's a gallery? But the concept of a gallery didn't exist. So I'd never seen one before. But then I realized, oh my God, the only work I've ever actually seen of his was CSS Beauty itself. And some of you are probably looking at this and think, oh, well, it's not that special, it's not that unique. But at the time, it was extremely special and it was extremely unique. And the version I saw was much more rudimentary than this, but it was important because not only was Alex doing CSS for layout and doing extraordinary design, but he was also putting it into a CMS. And that was kind of a radical thought and a radical shift. That not only could you put this into something like text pattern or Blogger or movable type, but you could actually take some of these forward-thinking CMSs that had started to use CSS for layout. That's kind of why we loved Blogger at the time. It was one of the first mainstream, and it was a blogging tool. But if you really think about what a blogging tool is, right, it's just content in a database, and you just get that content and you put it on the web page. That's a CMS, right? It's just a very rudimentary one. But we were doing extraordinary things. And so Alex, when he was first starting, he was a designer, and he was kind of like a back-end developer, but he really just kind of fell in love with the power of CSS, and really through people like Jeffrey Zeldman, who were talking about the power of sort of CSS for layout and what that could mean for the future, right? And probably the reason that all of us are in this room today for some of these dreams that people had early on. And Alex, he wanted to get into it. And so probably many of us, when we're first learning, right, there's probably no better tool. If we asked everyone in the room what their favorite tool is, we're going to go through a whole long list of them. But the reality is there's no better tool than the browser itself. And the most important function within the browser was probably view source for all of us. And so Alex decided, well, if I'm going to learn this stuff, I should just make a website. And he was already collecting a bunch of inspiration. So he just started to make a website, and he made this thing, and he called it CSS Beauty, and he put it up, and it turned out to be one of the most important inspiration galleries at its time to really push forward in a pretty important movement. That's kind of why all of us are here today. Alex and I went on many years later to start our own company together. It was called Include. It was a design agency based in Washington, D.C. And these are the years of Include. Every 2 years, we kind of knew we had to redesign. I'd love to have done it every 6 months, but it's not practical. It's no time. But we kind of agreed that every 2 years, we had to do it or we'd die inside. And so you can kind of see the transitions and sort of where we had gone and where we had ended up. But in the very beginning, we had started with just a very simple layout. But we were a very simple company. We didn't really have any clients. It was day one. We didn't really have a lot of work to show other than our own. But it was also a pretty simple time. There still weren't a lot of really great CMSs. JavaScript just really wasn't where it is today, and the processors to handle it really weren't where they were today. So doing something like having a cycle, that was a pretty big deal. Nobody had ever seen that before. There was no jQuery to sort of make it out of the box, where now it's a pretty overused thing, and you put a cycle on something, all of us kind of roll our eyes. But at the time, it was a fundamental shift and a fundamental thought, oh my God, You can show so much content in one little space. And now it's probably one of the most abused uses of JavaScript that we have. But we wanted to transition that, and we wanted to constantly show that we don't need these huge radical redesigns, that we can go from one to another, but really, not even focusing on the visual aesthetic, but really focusing on the code behind and knowing that that is what was really being redesigned. That's what was really changing every 2 years. Because as a designer, my aesthetic is my aesthetic. I get a little bit better, I get a little bit more skilled, but at this age, I'm kind of I'm the designer that I am. Right? I'll continue to be inspired, but I'm only going to be as good as I am. But on the code side, I might continually be better as a front-end developer, but the world is getting better. The computers, the machines are getting better. The browser support is getting far superior. The things that we can do with CSS3 and CSS4 and animations and transitions and HTML5 are constantly getting stronger. The damn iPhone, the iPad, right? It's changing everything every single day. By the time this talk starts, by the time it ends, there's some 14-year-old somewhere in the world that just released something that makes all of us go, shit, I'm getting old. I don't know how that kid just did that. But what was important about Alex is he started with this little hobby, because he just wanted to learn CSS. And he created CSS Beauty. It got him one of his first jobs. It got him his first job as a designer. It introduced him to me, which is pretty important for both of us. It let us create this magnificent agency. We went on to do some really special things. But one of the most important things it allowed us to do was hire people. And we could start to hire the people that we wanted to hire. And this was pretty important. We wanted to hire people that understood that when we talk about design, I'm really talking about information design, visual design, and technical design. And I want developers and front-end developers that think about the power of design. And I want, for when I view source, or I look at your code base, to say, my God, that's beautiful. Just the same way I might look at a visual aesthetic. And this was the first intern we ever had. His name's Michael Dick. He's actually here today. Years later, we have gone on to start a new company together. That was like 7 years ago. But Michael came with us at a time where mobile wasn't really a thing. Pre-iPhone, we had WAP was sort of the word that you used. There were BlackBerries. You had access to the web, but you didn't really have good support. It was worse than email today. So, very limited with what you could do with CSS. Don't even think about using JavaScript. And it was really interesting, the constraints that we were in, but we knew that the world was coming to something bigger and something better. We were watching devices get released. We were seeing the small, minute sort of advances that BlackBerry was making. We were starting to see interesting devices like the Blackjack come out that started to handle web really, really well. We started to see that the Motorola Razr allowed just about anybody to get basic access to the web. And then eventually we get the iPhone, which kind of changes everything in terms of how we think about mobile web and how we access mobile web. But Michael, very early on, knew that this was an important thing. He had grown up in a world where Alex and I and the Zeldmans and everyone, a lot of the people in this room had sort of done the hard work, and we'd gotten to a place where CSS for layout was a thing. We weren't really bitching about it or complaining about it. We all agree. We didn't have to fight that fight anymore. But mobile was a big fight, and it was the same fight that we had before with the same sorts of arguments. What about JavaScript? What about IE? What about browser support? What about download speeds? And we knew that this is going to be that same fight, and we knew that we'd have to fight against it the same way we did before. And so Michael started thinking about, well, when you guys are doing your next version of the include redesign, why don't we think about a mobile-centric approach to it? Why don't we even think about a mobile-first approach to it? Which today, again, that sounds like a cliche, right? It sounds like something your boss says and you roll your eyes, like when they use words like responsive and you're like, oh my God. But at the time, it was a revolutionary thought. I had never heard anybody in the entire world ever say, why don't you think about mobile first? I was like, wow, that's so fascinating. I love the idea because simplicity is everything. So why don't we break it down to its core basic, even without style sheets? And a lot of us were doing that at some point, right? How do we, when we were talking about the separation of presentation from structure, what does it look like when there's no style? Structurally, what is this? And we thought, well, this is no different when we talk about mobile. And so Michael took it on himself to I'm just going to do it. I'm going to design it, and they're going to love the visual aesthetic, but what they're really going to love is the code behind it. I'm going to build it. And he built it, and it was amazing, and it was beautiful. And by the time that the iPhone came out, it just needed a few tweaks, and it was even more beautiful. What was important is this is a fundamental step for Michael because he's looking at mobile. He's looking at before anybody can do anything with it, before there's any devices that can do anything with it. And we're kind of doing what we do now with responsive, right? We take our browser down really small, but there was no rhyme or reason to do it at that point. There was no reason to look at it at a 320 pixel width because there was no device in the world that could ever look at it at 320 pixel width. But we knew the power of fluid, and we knew the power of liquid, and so we knew that eventually that's where it would go. And so Michael's little experiment with the Include website fundamentally puts him on a track where when the iPhone does get released, everybody wants a mobile website, right? And that's where Ethan Marcotte starts to work on responsive. It's where the industry starts to move towards a world of mobile first. And Michael ends up going on to designing and developing the experiences for VentureBeat and Mashable and a handful of others from National Journal to Washington Post to Kiplinger, but all on the mobile side, but only because he was one of the first ones. And only because he decided to take an experiment and really take it as far as he can possibly take it, and even beyond where current devices were at, beyond where the consumer market was. And for us, a lot of it was just making sure that we believed in him and that we could push him forward. And this is some of that early work. The very first Include redesign, especially when it was edited for iPhone, and the very first Mashable iOS app as soon as the SDK was released. This was both native and mobile web. David DeSandro is another person I want to talk about. That's probably a name that most of you are probably familiar with, or you're definitely familiar with some of his work. Things like Isotope, creating patterns and modules and interfaces that really shape and transform this industry. For anyone that's ever used Pinterest, that UI is fundamentally inspired by the work that David has done. And David was one of our fourth hires, and he created Masonry, which is the cascading grid layout library. Some of you have probably used this or familiar with it or seen some version of it that someone else has adapted since. And for David, it was really interesting because when we met him, he was just graduated college, economics major, never had a front-end job, just kind of thought it was fun, right? Had heard about this web thing, played around a little bit, but never thought he could make a career out of it. But we were following anybody and everybody that was trying to do anything interesting that most modern-day browsers couldn't support. Because for us, it was fundamentally important to know that if that's what you're doing, the day that the browser can support it is not the day to start learning it. That's the day to dominate that market, especially if we're thinking about it from like a business perspective. And so David is constantly thinking about these things. And he develops Masonry as sort of a side project, a hobby, this idea that he didn't like the constraints that CSS was putting on him. Because again, he was a little bit older, so this whole argument or this whole fight about CSS for layout was sort of over. And for him, he thought, well, that was boring. Why, now that we have these, this awesome, we can do all this awesome stuff with layout, we have these grid systems, why are we now confined to the grid system? Why as designers do we feel like we're stuck in the grid? And we almost, from a technical perspective, limited ourselves to the grid. So he just asked a simple question. How can I start breaking outside of the grid? How can I start doing really interesting, compelling things? And how can I really start now taking JavaScript to a place it had never been before? And this becomes fundamentally important for us because this is the moment at which we're starting to think, where can we go beyond sort of the out-of-the-box jQuery UIs? Where can we start to take JavaScript, where it can start to be supported a little bit better, where we can start to even get to a world where modern-day web apps are almost built fundamentally by things like JavaScript and on the client side. So Dave goes on to do a handful of other experiments. And one of the ones he does is he's really interested in the power of CSS, and he's really interested in what you can do with CSS, especially when you don't need to limit yourself to the use of images to do really interesting things, right? So it's the first time when we're starting to think about rounded corners without CSS. Right now, that's kind of rolling your eyes, but that was such a fundamental thing the first time we saw somebody round a corner without using JavaScript or images, and it was just like, jaw-dropping. Holy shit, I can't believe that just happened. Changed everything. It's one of those moments where you got back to your computer and you just thought, oh my God, nothing's ever going to be the same again. So Dave did something pretty ironic where he wanted to recreate the Opera logo, which had just been redesigned. And this is several years ago. But he wanted to do it in CSS and use no images and use no JavaScript. And this is what it looked like in sort of Firefox 3.6, Chrome 5, Opera 10.5, and then IE 6, 7, and 8, and really just kind of visually connoting to us where some of the limitations were in terms of support. Now, this is fascinating for a couple of reasons. One, It's a different way to communicate the limitations that are happening, right? Just saying that something isn't supported, from one browser to the next. It's kind of like a limited argument because it only really stays within the understanding of this room. But when you show this to somebody else, the rest of the world gets how big the problem is. But what was really great is that Opera really understood how big the problem was. And Opera, literally within 72 hours, pushed an update to the Opera browser that now supported a handful of the things that were required in CSS to make this happen, just because the irony that the Opera logo that Dave had made wouldn't display in Opera itself. And that's just radical to me, right? But it's the power of how Dave did his experiment and how he picked who he was going to use as a taste base and how he visually showed the world what he was doing. And this was a really important moment, not only for sort of the adaptations of browser support, and now that they're working at rapid speeds and we're seeing things in Google's Canary that are happening at rapid times, but how we start to make the argument that things are broken, and how we can start to show that the world should look like this, and this is what you're giving us, and that there's a huge disconnect between the two. So Dave was on this rant, right? After that little bit of Opera buzz and them responding so quickly, that was just fascinating to Dave. And so he thought, wow, this is going to be the future, right? This future where we're using images as little as possible, where we're starting to think about things like SVG for the first time. The idea of a transparent PNG is now an archaic thought, whereas at the time, to have transparent images was huge, that we could have transparent PNGs. But so it's all he could think about. Right? I mean, this is not certainly something that we could put into our clients' work, because it didn't work in hardly any browsers at all. It wasn't highly supported. It required a ridiculous amount of markup at the time, where for us, it's still, in terms of size and HTTP requests, smaller than using images, but it wasn't practical in any means. It was more crazy than it was practical. But we constantly thought about, well, how can we put out these experiments? How can we put out these ideas? How can we show the world what's possible, but do it in a way that really gets the idea across quicker and faster, right? Almost to the point where we want it to break, where if it breaks, that's when we've done something good. And so Dave, we decided to go to South by Southwest, as back then we always did, and we wanted to throw a party. And this year we were going to do this thing called Beer Camp. We were just kind of sick of all the mini conferences. There were bar camps everywhere, right? And so we thought, okay, let's just be funny about it and call it Beer Camp, because that's all we really wanted to do anyway. That's where the good inspiration comes from, right? It's over a beer, or just casually talking. You can have a coffee too. But we thought, okay, well, this is interesting, right? Because South by Southwest is a bunch of front-end nerds, right? They get it. And we're going to have a party for them, so let's just create something that when they see it, well, the rest of the world is going to break for them, and that's fine, right? We get a client that calls us up and says, hey, your Beer Camp website is broken. I say, well, if it's broken, whatever browser you're using, you're using the wrong browser, and two, you're not invited to the party, right? So, and we knew if any of you guys saw a broken experience, and you had known that we had built it, or more importantly, that Dave had built it, you probably assume that you're broken. And this was a huge thought at the time, right? My website's not broken. Your browser's broken. Nobody had ever said that before, right? It was never a thought or an idea. Just imagine how powerful that was at this very one moment. And so we put this out there, and that's the position we take. You cannot say anything to us about how broken this is, because you're only amplifying the message that whatever tool you're using or whatever environment you're in is broken itself. And it was a huge success, and it was just a powerful website, and the fact that all the things that he could do. And we went on to do it every year since then, always pushing the boundaries, and I'll talk about it a little bit more. But one of the coolest things that Dave did, before I get off of him, is he designed the last version of Include before we sold it to Twitter. And the goal was to go crazy, right? Anything you could think of, let's just do it. And so this one was going to make a message that if you're seeing a broken experience, that you're working within a broken environment. The next one was going to say, hey, the industry is broken. And so Dave had a mission. He was going to create an amazing experience that would break your box. So he really wanted to make you have to restart your computer because of the shit he was going to do. But the statement was not that you're broken, but that the industry has somewhere to go. And when it does, and when it gets there, this is the kind of stuff we're going to start to see happen. Ian Storm, he was our third intern. We've had amazing luck with interns. All of them have gone on to do super successful things. But Ian just kind of came out of nowhere. He was a RISD student. For those of you who don't know, it's a really prestigious design school in the States, in Rhode Island. But Ian, I was worried he was too much of a designer. Like, I read his blog, and he was talking about the right things. He's talking about HTML5 2 years before Steve Jobs ever says it on TV, before it becomes like a cliche term. But I just didn't know if he really got front end the way that we did. But I'm like, you know what? Fuck it. He's an intern. Bring him in. So we bring him in. You know, what's the worst he could do? And I'm trying to like be a good boss, right? I don't even like the word boss, but I see him working on something, and I'm like, shit, like I want to ask him, like, what are you working on? Because it doesn't look like the thing that I asked him to work on, but then I don't want to be that guy, right? Like literally a micromanager over his shoulder, what is this? So I try to come up with like some really creative way to be like, hey man, so what you working on, right? Do it over lunch. And he tells me, he's like, oh, he's so excited. He's so glad I asked. He's like, no, come look at this, come look at this. So everyone's familiar with Event Apart, a list apart. They do this, well, they do challenges every year. And this is the first year that they did a challenge, and they called it a 10K apart. And what they wanted to do is to see what the group like us, this room, could do in under 10K. Right? And this is a result of a lot of the work that David done, right? Now that we're not using images, right? Because all that counted. Now that we're really being as minimalistic as possible and really thinking about the file size of, say, you know, the JavaScript that we're writing. And so Ian, he decides he wants to enter this contest. And he knows we're a pretty cool group and that we love this kind of stuff. So he really thought he'd take it on his own to do this, and he really thought it was going to impress us. Whereas most of us, right, we'd be terrified if we're working on like a side thing for our own benefit where like our company didn't ask us to do it, right? That's kind of like how you get fired. But Ian knew that that wasn't going to happen, and that wasn't the environment that we had. So he made this thing, and it was called mashups, but ups with 3 Ps. And what he did was, look at that, I have a picture. Just randomly hooked into the Dribble API and pulled in dribble shots. But it was that matching game, right? Like if you see this tile, you have to match it to another tile. He ends up winning best in design for this with 10K apart, which is fantastic for him, right? Like still in school, nobody knows who the heck he is, and now he's got the notoriety of somebody like Jeffrey Zeldman and A List Apart and Event Apart. And he's already now an award-winning designer, just that quickly. But what's fascinating is that he knew the power of what he could do. And he decided to start with one little experiment and see how far he could push it and the things that he could do. And it ends up working really well for him. Now he's in San Francisco. He started a company called Segment.io. I'm sure a lot of you have probably heard of it or tried it or probably have some thoughts whether it's a good way to go or not a good way to go. I won't get into Segment, but really fascinating stuff. But all that starts from this one little moment, this one little decision that he decides to do. Tom Giannatasio, one of my all-time favorites. He's like worse than my crappy cubicle in Beltsville, Maryland. He's at like the shittiest of all jobs, and he's working for some real estate company, just like cranking out real estate websites. Just you get like 2 hours to work on it, design it, build it, the whole thing, right? It's like literally asking you to do your worst possible work. But we find him, or he finds us rather. And he just goes nuts, because now he's around people like Michael Dick and David DeSandro and Ian Storm, and he just sees the wealth of potential, and obviously from what the world is showing as well, and he just gets into it. And he does a handful of things, but one of the most fun things that he did was he took the beer camp experience to one more year, and it was actually 2 years ago in Poland for Front Trends, and he decided, well, we're going to take beer camp international. Right, we're done. Well, everyone was done with South by Southwest, at least us. So when we come to beer camp, he's just gonna think of the craziest thing he can think of, right? Like, how can you really take whatever is new and emerging, like animations and transitions and CSS, and really show the world what's possible? And he created this really cool flipbook experience that some of you may have seen, but from now, you've seen a million things like it, right? We've seen Flipboard and 1,000 other things, but those all come from somewhere. And I'm not saying that they came from Tom, but they come from Tom and a bunch of people like Tom who are experimenting with the right things at the right time, at the right moment, but they find an audience and a place to experiment with them, right? So you can't just say, I'm going to build this for a client, I'm going to build this for my boss, because it'll never fly. But if we can find a place where it's appropriate, right, an audience of people like us that'll actually appreciate when it's broken because there's a message behind it, or really appreciate every line of code that was written here, where when you look at this, most of the world outside of this room just wants to see a beautiful experience and says, oh my God, it's so pretty, but everyone in this room views source instantly. What the hell did he do and how did he do it, right? And I'm almost at time, so I'm going to run through this really quick. Tom now went on, he went to Twitter, he went to MIT, and now he just built this product called Macaw, which I don't know if any of you have heard of, but if you haven't, you definitely want to check it out. It's macaw.co, and I don't want to plug Tom too much, but this is a moment, right? Like if I were giving this talk 5 years from now, this would be a very important moment, because I really think what they're doing now is going to push the entire industry forward in terms of how we think about writing and drawing code. Last one is Brian Innes, real quick. One of my last intern before we sold the company did a whole bunch of crazy stuff, but he's just really fun and engaging. But when he was an intern, never had a job in his life, right? He was just in college, came to us, and when we went to Twitter, we brought him with us. That's his first freaking job. Like his world is now ruined forever because all he knows is a world of like free bacon platters and celebrities coming by and ridiculously sized paychecks. So he's destined for another world of disappointment if he ever decides to leave. But this cool little graphic here is something Brian made just for fun when he got there, right? Because when he got there, he kind of had a stigma of an intern. And so that's something that's hard to fight against. And so Brian and I are just doing a lot of marketing for Twitter, especially the design team. And I was a design manager at the time. And he's like, I'm just going to make something cool. So like the design team kind of has like a mark, right? Just for no reason. Maybe no one ever uses it. Maybe no one ever sees it. Maybe it goes on like, we print it out an 8.5 by 11 and it gets stuck on a board somewhere. And that's it. Maybe that's the existence of it. But he does something cool. He uses all the assets within the Twitter brand, all the icons. It makes this symbol, right? You guys might like it. You might hate it. Who cares? But the design team liked it, right? Whether they liked what he did or they liked the fact that they had some kind of symbol that was theirs, it went on everything, stickers, t-shirts. But then he animated this thing. And he's a video guy, so he thought about making a video. But then he looked at his audience and said, well, this is a department of the best and brightest in web technologies. I can't make a freaking video. I got to code this thing. And I got to show that everything I would have done in video in say, a video editor, that I can do in the markup. Not only to show to them that he could do it, that he had the ability, but to show to himself, right? And then to show to a world that it was possible. And no one ever looked at him the same again. They all realized how good he was and the stuff he could do. And he's now the lead designer running Twitter.com. And so anyone who saw the new profiles, hate him or love him, that's the guy you blame. But I'll say there's probably a lot more feedback above him that probably had more input on what they look like today. But that's just an insane sort of journey. And I think I'll end it there. And that's me, @Smarty on Twitter. Follow me so I have more followers and then I look cool. Thanks, guys. Oh, I guess there's questions. I don't know if there's time. So if there's not time, then we can go to lunch. You can ask me there. But if there is time, because I know the earlier talk ended a little early, we can do that. So who's in charge of time here? Are we out of time? Yeah, I know I'm out of time. Are we out of time? 7 minutes. That is like 7 one-minute questions. Or 1 6-minute question.
Well, it's not really a very hard question. I was wondering if is there a place where we can check the sites that your friends made and check them ourselves right now, for example, in EA 11 and switching on the compatibility modes and checking how bad they were at the time. Is there some archives where we can find them, or can you post links to them on Twitter or something like that?
Yeah, I can definitely. Well, you know what I'll do is I'll post the Twitter handles of everyone I mentioned, and if they're any good, They have a website that has a reference to anything that they ever did that was any good. And so if you can't find it, it wasn't worth looking at probably. But I will tweet out from Smarty all the @handles of everyone I just mentioned here.
Thanks very much.
So are you saying that the fixed position bug I encountered on invite.com this morning was intentional on iOS 7?
So I have nothing to do with that is Mike's fault. But yeah, no, but that's a good example. That's a good question too, right? Because this whole idea of like an MVP, right? Like, and this whole idea of like fail fast, right? What does that mean? On some level, like I could say like, oh, that's a cop out, right? Like, why not like do perfect code, and why not do it well and do it right, and why have something that's so easily fixed, right? Like why does that even exist? And some might argue, well, there were 1,000 other things in front of it, and that's why it got missed, right? But so I live in the world where I want to be okay that not everything is perfect, but I want to know the end game of what I'm building is sort of bigger than anything, right? So my code, and I know a lot of you will hate me for saying this, or my code or my team's code, it won't always be perfect, and it'll be flawed, and there will be issues with it, but I think it's always to something bigger, right? It's always towards shaping an industry or inspiring a huge group of people, or eventually, with a lot of the stuff we did, everything that Dave and Tom and Alex did, it was huge. It was instrumental, and it got the attention of a lot of people. And it eventually got the attention of people like Apple, and they were our largest client. And we designed, anyone here that has iTunes or App Store, that's all code that we write. We helped write. I'm not going to take credit for all of it, but we helped write. And that's from all of these experiments, because they wanted people, and they contacted us years before Steve Jobs ever says HTML5, because they're building towards something bigger, and they're building towards something better, but at a very important time. And they want people that think the right way. And I think that's the most important part of everything I'm trying to talk about, is surround yourself around people or audiences that think like you do, and then target them and go after them and build things for them, right? Turn those hobbies into those experiments and put them in front of those people, because that's where they're going to get appreciated, and that's where they're going to become something bigger than life.
So real artistship is what you're saying.
Yeah. All right, one more. Who's it going to be? I'll buy you lunch. All right, no more. Thanks, guys.